What happened next shocked everyone when a slave man saw his master's wife crying by the river in Georgia, 1834. Such encounters were forbidden by the plantation's brutal hierarchy. Yet, something in Eleanor Thornton's despair called to Elijah's humanity. Shock waves were sent through the entire county by what transpired after he approached her that misty morning. But how this forbidden moment of compassion would unleash forces that neither master nor slave could control was what no one could have predicted. When Elijah slipped through the morning mist toward the river, the sun had barely risen over the Georgia pines. Another day of backbreaking labor would soon awaken the plantation. But these precious moments before the overseer's bell, gathering medicinal herbs, were his only taste of freedom. As he moved silently through the undergrowth, basket in hand, the damp earth beneath his calloused feet felt almost like a blessing. But mid-step, he froze as he rounded the bend where wild yarrow grew thickest. There, perched on a moss-covered stone by the water's edge, sat Mrs. Eleanor Thornton. Her expensive silk dress, the pale blue one for special visitors, was pulled around her like spilled water. With silent sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken inside her, her delicate shoulders shook. Every instinct, every painful lesson beaten into him since childhood, screamed for him to retreat. The lash or worse could mean a slave acknowledging a white woman's vulnerability, especially the master's wife. Men had been hanged for less. As he began to step backward, his heart hammered against his ribs, praying the rustling leaves wouldn't betray his presence. But something dangerous was stirred in him by her broken posture, by the way her fingers clutched a handkerchief already soaked with tears, compassion. Perhaps it was the memory of his own mother crying just like this after being separated from his sister at auction. Perhaps it was simply that she looked as trapped in this moment as he felt every day of his life. The words left his mouth before wisdom could stop them. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Hanging in the misty air between them like a transgression made sound. Eleanor's head snapped up, eyes wide with fear, then recognition. A single tear traced its way down her porcelain cheek, catching the first golden ray of sunlight breaking through the trees. For 3 heartbeats, the entire weight of social barriers hung suspended between them. Slave and mistress, black and white, property and owner. Then something extraordinary happened. She spoke to him not as a master to a slave, but as one human being to another. "No, Elijah, nothing is all right." Her voice trembled like a leaf in autumn, vulnerability raw in every syllable. "Nothing has been all right for a very long time." That simple truth, exchanged by the rushing waters that cared nothing for the artificial boundaries of men, crossed a line as forbidden as the river was deep. Something shifted in the very foundation of their existence in that moment, an acknowledgement of shared humanity that the entire architecture of southern plantation life was designed to prevent. The herbs in his basket suddenly forgotten, Elijah shifted his weight. He should leave now. Every second in her presence increased the danger. Yet his feet remained rooted to the spot as she looked up at him with eyes that seemed to truly see him. "You gather plants for healing," she said softly. Not a question, but a recognition. "My grandmother taught me about such things before she stopped herself, another tear falling, "before I came here." That they had set in motion events that would shake the Thornton plantation to its very foundation, neither could know with those words, with that moment of genuine connection. That this chance encounter would spiral outward, touching lives far beyond their own, igniting both terrible darkness and unexpected light. What Elijah didn't know, as he cautiously stepped closer to hear her next words, was that this single act of compassion would soon place both their lives in mortal danger. That by sunrise the following week, blood would be spilled, fire would light the night sky, and nothing on the Thornton plantation would ever be the same again. Looming white and imposing against the Georgia sky was the Thornton plantation house. Its columned facade masked the rot that festered within its walls. In every direction stretched 600 acres of cotton fields. A kingdom built on broken backs and stolen lives. The memory of Eleanor's tear-stained face haunted him like a ghost he couldn't exorcise as Elijah returned to his cabin that evening. What could possibly drive the mistress of such grandeur to such depths of despair? The question followed him through his evening meal, a meager portion of cornmeal and fatback, and into his dreams, where Eleanor's blue eyes seemed to plead for something he couldn't name. Morning came too soon, the overseer's bell shattering what little rest he'd managed to find. 3 days passed in the familiar rhythm of plantation life. Sunrise to sunset in the fields. Fingers bleeding from cotton bolls. The overseer's whip cracking nearby, not on his back today, but the threat ever present. Each hour stretched like molasses as Elijah worked, his mind elsewhere, replaying those few dangerous moments by the river. On the 4th morning, as he chopped firewood behind the kitchen house, an easier task assigned to him because of his knowledge of herbs and occasional service in the main house, a shadow fell across his path. Elijah looked up, axe mid-swing, to find Eleanor standing there. She wore a simple day dress of sprigged muslin, her hair pulled back severely, composed, but pale as porcelain. A folded note was clutched in her trembling hand. "My husband will be gone until sundown," she whispered, eyes darting nervously toward the main house where servants might see them. "There's something you need to see, something I can't bear alone anymore." Every instinct warned against following her. Elijah had survived 32 years in bondage by knowing exactly where the boundaries lay and never crossing them. Being alone with the master's wife wasn't just crossing a boundary, it was leaping over it into an abyss. Yet curiosity and something else, something he dared not name even in the privacy of his thoughts, pulled him forward. "It's dangerous, ma'am," he murmured, setting down the axe with deliberate care. "Everything is dangerous," she replied, a flash of bitterness in her voice. "Especially the truth." Through the servants' entrance they went, Eleanor leading the way with the practiced stealth of someone accustomed to moving unnoticed in her own home. Up narrow back stairs they climbed. Footsteps muffled on expensive carpet imported from England. Elijah had never been in this part of the house before. These were the family's private quarters, forbidden territory. His heart thundered so loudly he was certain it would give them away. In Master Thornton's study, Eleanor locked the door behind them. The room smelled of tobacco, leather, and beeswax polish. The trappings of wealth and power were evident in every carefully chosen piece of furniture. A portrait of Master Thornton himself hung above the fireplace, his cold eyes seeming to follow them accusingly. "I found these last month," she said, pulling a leather-bound ledger from beneath a loose floorboard near the window seat. "Robert's private accounts, not the ones he shows his business partners or even his bank." As Elijah's eyes scanned the pages she opened before him, his blood turned to ice in his veins. The ledger detailed transactions far more sinister than cotton sales or land purchases. Human cargo smuggled in through the coastal marshes despite the federal ban on slave importation. Names, ages, prices paid, and profits made. Men, women, and children, some as young as 7 or 8, reduced to inventory. And worse, much worse, evidence of brutal punishments inflicted on those who resisted or tried to escape, recorded with chilling precision, deaths disguised as accidents or illness, families separated deliberately to crush spirits, breeding programs described in the same dispassionate terms used for livestock. "There's more," Eleanor whispered, voice breaking as she turned to the last section, the final pages. There, in Master Thornton's meticulous handwriting, was a list of names, plantation owners throughout the county, state officials, even a federal judge, dates of meetings, coded messages, sums of money changing hands. A conspiracy reaching far beyond these walls, with tentacles extending into the very institutions meant to enforce what few protections the law provided. "If these men discover I've seen this," Eleanor's words hung in the air between them. The unfinished sentence, more terrifying than any threat spoken aloud. "Why show me this?" Elijah finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the river. "Why risk everything?" Eleanor's eyes, when they met his, held a complexity of emotion he'd never been permitted to see in a white woman's face before. Fear, yes, but also determination, shame, and something that might have been hope. "Because I can't bear it alone anymore," she whispered. "And because you," she stopped, seeming to search for words. "Because I've watched you. The way you care for the others. The way you saved Bessie's baby when the doctor wouldn't come. The herbs you gather. The stories the children say you tell them. You see people as people. The study door rattled suddenly, the brass handle turning against the lock. A harsh voice called Eleanor's name from the hallway. Footsteps approached, heavy, familiar footsteps. Master Thornton returned early from town. Their eyes met in shared terror as the key scraped in the lock from the outside. In that heart-stopping moment, as Eleanor hastily shoved the ledger back beneath the floorboard, Elijah realized the terrible truth that would change everything. Knowledge was the most dangerous possession of all, and they now held enough to get them both killed. The door swung open. With a force that made the hinges groan in protest, the study door swung open. Eleanor's hands froze over the floorboard, the incriminating ledger not yet fully concealed beneath the polished wood. Her face drained of color, fingers trembling like autumn leaves in a storm. Elijah stood rooted to the spot, knowing that discovery meant certain death, not a quick one, but the kind meant to send a message to anyone else who dared step beyond their prescribed place in the cruel hierarchy of plantation life. But it wasn't Robert Thornton who stood in the doorway. Miss Eleanor, it was Martha, the elderly house servant who had been with the Thornton family since before Eleanor's marriage. Keys dangled from her work-worn hands, the master key set she was entrusted with as head of the household staff. Her eyes widened at the sight of Elijah standing in the master's study, then darted to Eleanor, kneeling by the window seat, her expensive dress pulled around her on the floor. Mr. Thornton's carriage just turned into the drive. He's back early and in a foul temper. Something about trouble at the bank. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly, each second marking how close they came to disaster. Then Martha's gaze settled on the partially visible ledger, understanding dawning in her eyes like the slow rise of a winter sun. Without a word, she stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. The soft click of the latch somehow more final than a slam. "Whatever you're doing, finish it quick," she whispered, moving to help Eleanor secure the floorboard. Her gnarled fingers worked alongside Eleanor's slender ones, pressing the wood back into place. "I'll tell him you're lying down with a headache from the heat. Elijah, there's linens waiting to be brought up in the East Hall. Look busy with them." The floorboard slid back into place with a barely audible thump just as the front door slammed below, followed by Robert Thornton's booming voice demanding whiskey and his wife's presence immediately. The sound of his heavy boots on the main staircase sent a jolt of terror through the room. "Go," Martha urged, straightening Eleanor's dress and pinching color back into her cheeks. "I saw nothing. Nothing. Been that way 50 years in this house. No reason to change now." There was something in the old woman's eyes, a flash of something that might have been solidarity or might have been warning. As Elijah slipped into the hallway, linens hastily gathered in his arms from the nearby linen press, he caught Martha's knowing gaze. The old woman had spent 5 decades in this house. There were few secrets she hadn't witnessed, few cruelties she hadn't endured. But whose side was she truly on? Could they trust her silence? Or would fear of the master's wrath loosen her tongue? He made it downstairs through the servants' passage just as Robert Thornton reached the upper floor. The master's irritated questions about his wife's whereabouts faded behind him. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, the beauty of the estate a cruel mockery of the suffering that maintained it. That night, unable to sleep on his thin pallet, Elijah startled at a soft scratching at his cabin door, alert instantly. Such sounds at night often meant trouble. He waited, barely breathing, until a folded paper slid beneath the rough-hewn door. When he was certain no one lingered outside, he retrieved it with trembling fingers. The note contained just 4 words in Eleanor's delicate handwriting: "The cellar, midnight tomorrow." He burned the note immediately in his small hearth, watching the elegant script curl and blacken until it was nothing but ash. Even the smallest evidence could condemn them both. Dawn brought news that chilled the entire plantation. 3 slaves had escaped from neighboring Wilkes County plantation during the night. Bloodhounds were being gathered from across the county. Patrols had been doubled on all major roads. The timing couldn't possibly be worse for clandestine meetings or dangerous secrets. Throughout the day, tension hung over the fields like the oppressive humidity that made shirts cling to backs and breathing laborious. The overseers were especially vigilant, quick to use the whip for even minor infractions. Twice Elijah saw Robert Thornton deep in conversation with men he recognized from the ledger's list. Powerful men with cruel eyes who looked at the workers as one might assess furniture or livestock. "They're scared," whispered Isaiah, an older man who worked the row beside Elijah. "When masters get scared, we suffer. Something's brewing. Mark my words." As darkness fell the following evening, Elijah faced an impossible choice. Meeting Eleanor meant risking everything: his relative's safety as a valued worker, the small freedoms he'd earned through years of careful obedience, perhaps his very life. Yet the ledger's secrets might be the key to something larger than his own survival. Knowledge that powerful could be a weapon if wielded carefully. Beyond the fields, the baying of hounds carried on the wind, a sound that had struck terror into the hearts of the enslaved for generations. The patrols would be especially alert tonight, watching for any unusual movement. The moon, nearly full, offered little concealment as it rose above the tree-line, bathing the plantation in silver light that turned shadows sharp-edged and revealing. With trembling resolve, Elijah waited until the last lamp was extinguished in the overseer's cabin. He slipped from his own dwelling, keeping to the deepest shadows, moving with the practiced silence of a man who had learned that invisibility was often his only protection. Each footfall could betray him. Each breath seemed too loud in the quiet night. The main house rose before him like a pale ghost, its columned facade gleaming in the moonlight. The cellar entrance was around back, accessible through the kitchen garden, where herbs and vegetables for the master's table grew in neat, orderly rows. As he crept past the smokehouse, a dog barked in the distance, making him freeze in place, heart hammering against his ribs. What waited in that cellar might be salvation or doom, but there was no turning back now. The pieces were in motion, and history itself seemed to hold its breath as Elijah made his way toward a meeting that would forever alter the course of countless lives. Whatever happened in the hours to come would ripple outward, touching not just the Thornton plantation, but perhaps the very foundations of the world they inhabited, a world built on cruelty and division that perhaps, just perhaps, contained the seeds of its own transformation. As he reached for the cellar door, weathered wood rough beneath his calloused fingers, Elijah sent up a silent prayer to ancestors whose names had been stolen, but whose strength flowed in his veins. The latch lifted with a soft click, and he descended into darkness, each step taking him further from everything he had known, and closer to a future impossible to imagine. Thick with the scent of earth, wine, and secrets, the cellar air hung heavy. Slowly, Elijah descended the worn stone steps, each creak threatening to announce his presence to the wrong ears. The darkness pressed against him like a physical weight, broken only by the faint glow emanating from deeper within the underground chamber. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out even the chorus of night insects that had accompanied his dangerous journey across the moonlit grounds. A single lantern cast long shadows against the rough walls, illuminating Eleanor's face in golden light as she emerged from behind a row of dusty wine barrels. The flames' dance made her appear almost spectral, a ghost haunting the foundation of her husband's empire. "You came," she whispered, relief evident in her voice. She wore a simple dark dress, her hair covered by a servant's cap, a disguise that would offer little protection if they were discovered. Up close, Elijah could see the strain of recent days etched in the fine lines around her eyes, the pallor beneath her naturally fair complexion. "I wasn't certain you would risk it." "I had to know," Elijah replied, keeping his distance. Trust was a luxury neither of them could afford completely. He remained close to the stairs, ready to flee if necessary, though escape would be nearly impossible if they were truly discovered. "The patrols are doubled tonight. Dogs at the property line." Eleanor nodded grimly. "Robert's been in a state since the Wilkes County escape. 3 men gone, including the blacksmith he'd intended to purchase next month." A hint of satisfaction colored her words. "Despite the danger, he fears it's organized." "He's right to fear it." She glanced nervously toward the stairs. Martha's keeping watch. She's with us. Elijah had been for years in her own quiet way. Her voice dropped even lower. She helped my mother hide runaways in this very cellar 20 years ago. Before Mother died and Robert took over the plantation. Before everything changed. This revelation struck Elijah like a physical force. The Thornton plantation had once been part of the Underground Railroad. The irony was almost too much to comprehend. Eleanor pulled a small bundle from beneath her shawl, the ledger wrapped in oilcloth, and something else, a folded map, yellowed with age, its creases worn thin from repeated handling. Robert's part of something larger than I ever suspected, she continued, spreading the map across an old barrel top. Her fingers trembled slightly as she weighted the corners with small stones. These markings show a network, underground routes for smuggling, safe houses, contacts in port cities. He and the others, they're bringing in hundreds of people illegally each year through the coastal marshes. The profit is enormous. Elijah studied the map, his mind racing as he took in the web of lines and symbols stretching across Georgia, South Carolina, and down into Florida. Some notations were in code, others painfully clear in their meaning, holding pen capacity, 30. Deep water access. Patrol schedule. These routes, he said slowly, tracing one line that followed the Savannah River inland, they could be used differently. Their eyes met in shared understanding. The same paths that brought people into bondage might lead them to freedom. There's more, Eleanor said, her voice dropping further as she flipped through the ledger to pages Elijah hadn't seen before. There's to be a meeting here 3 nights from now. All the men from the ledger, 12 in total, including the judge and the sheriff. I've overheard enough to know they're planning something terrible, a coordinated response to the abolitionists' growing influence in the North. Violence against even those who speak of emancipation. They fear what's happening in Massachusetts and New York might spread south. She turned another page, revealing a list of names that made Elijah's blood run cold. These are their targets. People they believe sympathize with abolition. Clergymen, newspaper editors, even 3 plantation owners suspected of treating their slaves too humanely. Her finger stopped at one name circled in red ink. Including my cousin William in Savannah, who's spoken publicly against the cruelty he's witnessed. The implications were staggering. Not just smuggling and individual acts of brutality, but an organized conspiracy to violently suppress even the whisper of freedom. The Thornton plantation wasn't just a place of bondage, it was a headquarters for something far more sinister. The sound of a door opening above froze them both mid-breath. Footsteps crossed the kitchen floor, heavy and deliberate, a man's tread, not Martha's lighter step. Eleanor. Robert Thornton's voice called out, irritation evident in every syllable. Are you down there? Answer me, woman. In one fluid motion, Eleanor shoved the map and ledger into Elijah's hands. Take these. There's a loose stone in the root cellar behind your cabin, 3rd from the left corner near the floor. Martha will find you tomorrow with more information. She pressed something cold and metal into his palm. My father's compass. Find the North Star if all else fails. The footsteps were on the stairs now, each one bringing destruction closer. Eleanor quickly mussed her hair and grabbed an empty wine bottle from a nearby rack as Elijah slipped behind the massive oak wine casks, pressing himself into the narrow space between the barrels and the damp stone wall. Spiderwebs clung to his face, and he fought the urge to brush them away as he tucked the precious documents inside his shirt. There you are, Robert's voice carried an edge of suspicion that sent ice through Elijah's veins. What are you doing down here at this hour, alone in the dark? I couldn't sleep, Eleanor replied. Her voice transformed into the delicate, slightly vapid tone she adopted in her husband's presence. The change was remarkable, from conspirator to fragile Southern belle in an instant. Dr. Phillips suggested burgundy for my nerves after my spell yesterday. You know how I hate to trouble the servants at night. They work so hard, poor things. From his hiding place, Elijah barely breathed as Robert chastised his wife for her foolishness. The master's boots scraped against the stone floor as he moved further into the cellar, coming dangerously close to Elijah's hiding spot. "You shouldn't be down here alone," Robert said, his tone softening slightly but retaining its edge. "These are dangerous times, Eleanor. The Negroes from Wilkes County, they're still at large. Who knows what desperate acts they might attempt?" "You're right, of course, dear," Eleanor replied, a tremor in her voice that might have been fear of discovery or revulsion at her husband's touch as he took her arm. "I wasn't thinking clearly. The headache, you know. Come upstairs. I'll have Martha bring you laudanum." The barrel nearest Elijah creaked as Robert leaned against it, causing him to press deeper into the shadows. "Strange, though," Robert continued. "I could have sworn I heard voices." The silence that followed stretched unbearably. Elijah's lungs burned with the need for air. "The old house settles," Eleanor finally said. "And the wind through the ventilation grates often sounds like whispers. It used to frighten me when we first married. Remember? You told me it was just the ghosts of Thornton's past keeping watch." A low chuckle from Robert broke the tension. "So I did. Come along now before you catch a chill in this damp." Only when their voices faded completely and the door at the top of the stairs closed with a definitive thud did Elijah dare move, the precious contraband clutched against his chest. He waited 5 more agonizing minutes, counting each second, before carefully emerging from his hiding place. The cellar suddenly seemed full of threatening shadows, each darker corner potentially concealing another unexpected visitor. Moving silently, as only someone who had spent a lifetime avoiding notice could, Elijah made his way to the stairs, pausing at each step to listen for sounds from above. Outside, the night had grown darker as clouds obscured the moon, a blessing for a man who needed invisibility more than ever. The air smelled of approaching rain, another small mercy that might cover the sound of his movement across the grounds. As Elijah crept back toward the slave quarters, the weight of what he carried felt far heavier than paper and ink. It was knowledge that could bring down an empire of cruelty or end his life in unspeakable ways. He skirted the kitchen garden, freezing in place when the back door of the main house opened unexpectedly. A sliver of light cut across the lawn, then disappeared as the door closed again. Someone had stepped out briefly, looking for something. For him. Elijah remained motionless behind a large gardenia bush, its sweet scent almost overpowering in the humid night air. When no further movement came from the house, he continued his perilous journey, keeping to the deepest shadows. The slave quarters lay a quarter-mile from the main house, close enough for convenience, but far enough to maintain the illusion of separation between the worlds of master and slave. On normal nights, the distance felt like a small mercy. Tonight it seemed an impossible expanse of exposed ground to cover. Behind him, the great house loomed silent and malevolent, windows dark except for the faint glow from what must be the master's study on the second floor. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and perhaps the faintest glimmer of what had seemed impossible just days before, hope. In the distance, a whip-poor-will called 3 times, the signal that the night patrols were changing shifts. Elijah had 15 minutes to reach safety before fresh eyes would scan the grounds. 15 minutes to decide whether the risk of rebellion was greater than the certainty of continued bondage. 15 minutes to choose between the devil he knew and the uncertain freedom that might lie beyond Thornton land. The documents pressed against his skin seemed to burn with their dangerous knowledge. If discovered, they meant certain death, not just for him, but for Eleanor, for Martha, for anyone connected to this fragile conspiracy of truth. Yet they also represented something he'd scarcely allowed himself to imagine: leverage, power, a weapon against the system that had stolen his past and present. As he slipped through the shadows toward his cabin, navigating by memory and instinct through the familiar landscape turned treacherous by circumstance, one thought burned brighter than fear: some secrets were worth dying for, and this one might be worth living for. The first fat raindrop struck his cheek just as he reached the cluster of slave cabins. The storm's arrival would wash away his footprints and drive the patrols to seek shelter, small mercies in a night that had already delivered both terrible danger and unexpected possibility. In the root cellar behind his cabin, Elijah worked by touch alone to locate the stone Eleanor had described. His fingers found the slight irregularity, the edge that protruded just enough to grip. The stone came away with surprising ease, revealing a small cavity that must have been created generations ago for exactly this purpose. As he carefully placed the ledger, map, and compass in the hiding place, he wondered how many secrets this plantation had buried over the years, and how many were about to be unearthed. Thunder rolled across the sky as he replaced the stone and made his way to his cabin door. Inside, he struck no light but sat in darkness on the edge of his pallet, rain drumming on the roof above. Sleep would not come tonight, not with his mind racing through possibilities both glorious and terrible. 3 nights until the meeting of conspirators. 3 days to decide what to do with knowledge that could ignite a fire across the South. 3 chances to speak with Martha. To learn more. To plan. Find the North Star if all else fails, Eleanor had said. Elijah closed his eyes, picturing the night sky he knew so well, the constellation that had guided so many toward freedom. Perhaps it would soon guide him too, not just away from bondage, but toward justice. As lightning illuminated his sparse cabin in brief, brilliant flashes, Elijah made his decision. Whatever came next, freedom or death, victory or sacrifice, he would no longer be merely a witness to history. He would help write it. Morning broke with the merciless clarity that follows a storm. The air hung heavy with moisture as slaves filed out to the fields, eyes downcast, bodies already braced for the day's labor. The world had been washed clean by the night's deluge, yet nothing had truly changed. The same sun would scorch them. The same overseers would drive them. The same cotton would tear at their fingers until sunset granted temporary reprieve. Only Elijah carried the weight of something different, something dangerous, as he took his place among the workers. The muddy path to the field sucked at their feet, making each step a small struggle. Water droplets clung to the cotton plants like tears, soaking through threadbare clothing within minutes. The overseer, Jenkins, cursed the wet conditions that would slow the day's harvest, his foul mood promising swift punishment for anyone who failed to meet their quota despite the circumstances. Elijah joined the line, his face carefully composed to reveal nothing of the night's events or the dangerous knowledge hidden beneath his cabin floor. His hands moved automatically to the familiar task, mind racing behind a mask of subservience he'd perfected over decades. The ledger's contents, the map's revelations, Eleanor's warnings, all of it churned within him as his fingers worked the cotton bolls. "You look like you ain't slept," Isaiah murmured as they took up their positions in adjacent rows, the older man's eyes sharp despite his stooped posture. At 63, Isaiah had survived 3 masters and bore the scars of each on his back. The plantation's unofficial historian, he remembered names and stories others had been forced to forget. "Trouble?" "Just the storm," Elijah replied softly, aware of the overseer's gaze sweeping across them from his perch on horseback. Jenkins had a particular dislike for Elijah, whose literacy and position as a skilled carpenter granted him privileges that rankled the overseer's sense of proper hierarchy. "Thunder always keeps me awake." Isaiah's weathered face revealed nothing, but his fingers brushed Elijah's wrist in a gesture too deliberate to be accidental. "Martha sent word. Said to tell you the root vegetables need checking before they spoil." Elijah's heart skipped. So Martha had indeed planned to contact him, and trusted Isaiah as her messenger. The web of allies was wider than he'd realized. Connections forged in whispers and small gestures beneath the watchful eyes of their captors. He wondered how many others might be part of this invisible network. How many silent resistors existed among those who appeared most compliant. "Obliged," Elijah murmured, careful to keep his eyes on his work. "Wouldn't want good food going to waste." Isaiah nodded almost imperceptibly. "Storms have a way of uncovering what's been buried," he said, his words ostensibly about the vegetable cellar but carrying a weight that made Elijah glance sharply at him. The old man's face remained impassive as he added, "Some things are meant to see the light eventually." Before Elijah could respond, Jenkins rode closer, his horse's hooves splattering mud onto their already soaked clothing. "Less talking, more picking," he barked, slapping his riding crop against his thigh in implicit threat. "You're already behind, and the day's barely started." They fell silent, bowing their heads in the expected gesture of submission. Only when Jenkins had moved further down the line did Isaiah speak again, his voice barely audible over the sounds of labor surrounding them. "There's word from the Wilkes place," he breathed, fingers never ceasing their methodical work. "Something happened there before the escape. Something that has the white folk spooked worse than usual." The day stretched endlessly, the sun climbing high and merciless above the fields, burning away the morning's dampness and replacing it with stifling humidity. Shirts clung to backs, sweat stung eyes, and the relentless rhythm of harvest continued without pause. Elijah's thoughts kept returning to the hidden documents, to Eleanor's warning about the meeting, to the terrible possibilities that lay ahead. Around midday, a ripple of tension passed through the field as Robert Thornton appeared on the main path, accompanied by two men Elijah recognized from town. One, the banker Holloway, with his distinctive gold-headed cane and corpulent frame; the other, a plantation owner from the next county named Beaumont, known for his particular cruelty toward his slaves. Their conversation, though inaudible from the field, appeared heated, with Thornton gesturing emphatically toward the main house. "Something's got them riled," observed Naomi, a young woman working the row alongside Elijah. Despite being only 20, she had a husband and child on a plantation 10 miles away, whom she was permitted to visit only on Christmas Day, a separation that had never dimmed the fierce intelligence in her eyes. Those eyes, always quick and observant, followed the men as they disappeared into the house. Twice this week the masters had visitors before noon. "That ain't normal. Keep your head down," Elijah cautioned, though he filed away the information. The meeting Eleanor had mentioned was clearly causing ripples even before it occurred. "Jenkins is looking for reasons to use that whip today." Naomi's expression didn't change, but her voice carried a hint of something beyond the usual resignation. "My grandmother always said, troubles among the masters can mean either great danger or great opportunity for us. Question is knowing which is coming." The wisdom in her words struck Elijah forcefully. The documents hidden beneath his cabin floor represented both unimaginable danger and unprecedented opportunity. The challenge lay in navigating between them, in finding a path that led to freedom rather than destruction. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the field, a commotion near the road drew attention. Riders approached, 6 men, armed and grim-faced, led by the county sheriff, a tall, cadaverous man named Holt, whose reputation for brutality extended beyond the boundaries of Thornton Plantation. The overseer abandoned his post to meet them, and soon Robert Thornton himself emerged from the house, striding purposefully toward the group. Work slowed as every slave in the field strained to hear the exchange. Hands mechanically continuing their tasks while attention focused elsewhere. The sheriff's voice carried on the still air. "Found one of them Wilkes runaways. The other 2 still missing. Crossed the river, we think. Caught this one trying to steal a boat near Harper's Landing." Thornton's response was lost as he led the men toward the house, but his agitation was evident in every line of his body. The meeting was ushered inside, but not before several of the riders cast long, suspicious glances toward the field workers, their hands resting meaningfully on the pistols at their belts. "They're scared," Isaiah whispered as work reluctantly resumed under the overseer's renewed attention. "White folks only look that scared when they think we might be getting ideas." He paused, then added with quiet significance, "or when they know we already have them." The remainder of the afternoon passed in tense silence. Even Jenkins seemed subdued after the sheriff's visit, his usual stream of insults and threats reduced to occasional grunted commands. When the bell finally rang to signal the end of the workday, the relief was palpable, yet tempered by the knowledge that something ominous was building within the great house. When dusk finally brought release from the fields, Elijah made his way back to his cabin with deliberate normalcy, though every nerve screamed with urgency. He needed to check if the documents remained secure, needed to find Martha, needed answers to the 100 questions that had tormented him throughout the endless day. His cabin, one of the better structures in the slave quarters owing to his carpentry skills, stood slightly apart from the others. This small privilege, granted because his abilities made him valuable property, had often felt like a mixed blessing, more comfortable, yes, but also isolating. Tonight, however, he was grateful for the relative privacy. As he approached his door, he found Martha waiting, her presence explained by the basket of mending she'd brought, a common enough sight to avoid suspicion, as her duties included keeping the field workers' clothing serviceable. Her aged fingers worked steadily at patching a shirt as she spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "The meeting's been moved up. Tomorrow night, not 3 days hence. The sheriff brought news that's got them all in a panic." Her needle flashed in the fading light, the small, even stitches belying the tremor in her hands. One of the Wilkes County men was caught. Before they hanged him, he said something that frightened them badly. "What?" Elijah asked, his throat dry, stomach clenching at the fate of the escaped man, another soul who had reached for freedom only to be dragged back and destroyed for his audacity. Yet even in death, it seemed he had managed to strike fear into his oppressors. Martha's eyes, rheumy with age but sharp with intelligence, met his briefly. He told them it wasn't just a random escape. Said there's a network growing. Said even house slaves and trusted workers are part of it. Said the day of reckoning is coming. She lowered her voice further. Said they had friends and allies they never suspected, even among the white folk. The implication settled over Elijah like a physical weight. They believed him enough to hang him quick, before others could hear his words. Enough to move up their meeting. Enough to double the night patrols again. She set down her mending, the pretense momentarily abandoned as she leaned closer. They're planning something terrible, Elijah. Not just increased security. Eleanor overheard Robert talking about making examples. Cutting out the cancer before it spreads. A chill ran through him despite the evening's warmth. Mass punishments. Public executions. Martha nodded grimly. For anyone even suspected of sympathizing with runaways or abolition. They're talking about bringing in slave breakers from Charleston, men who specialize in rooting out resistance. Her gnarled fingers, twisted by decades of labor, gripped his wrist with surprising strength. And that's not the worst of it. They plan to sell off families. Separate children from mothers. Send troublemakers to the deep plantations in Louisiana, where few survive a year. Elijah closed his eyes briefly, the horror of it washing over him. Such tactics were not unknown, but their systematic application as planned by Thornton and his conspirators represented a new level of calculated cruelty. Eleanor says we have until tomorrow night to act. After that, whatever they're planning will be set in motion. Martha's voice had taken on an urgency he'd never heard from her before. The documents you have, they're not just evidence of smuggling. They're proof of their entire operation. Their finances, their bribes to officials. Names, dates, amounts paid. Enough to ruin them all if it reached the right hands. Act how? Elijah asked, the enormity of their situation threatening to overwhelm him. What can we possibly do against 12 powerful men, the sheriff among them? Even with these documents, who would listen to accusations from slaves and a planter's wife against the most influential men in the county? Martha's smile was thin but determined. The same thing slaves have always done when direct confrontation meant certain death. We use their assumptions against them. Their blindness. Their arrogance. She leaned closer. Eleanor has a plan. Tonight, after the house is dark. Come to the kitchen door. 3 taps. Pause. Then 2 more. What's she thinking to do? Elijah pressed, aware that each minute they spoke increased the danger of discovery. Martha gathered her mending, resuming her role as she prepared to leave. There's a man arriving tomorrow from Savannah. Eleanor's cousin, William, the one marked in the ledger as a target. He doesn't know he's coming into danger. She sent a message warning him to bring help. Specific help. What kind of help? Martha's eyes gleamed with a fierce light that belied her years. The kind that carries printing presses instead of whips. The kind that writes for northern newspapers about the evils of slavery. The kind that might be very interested in documents proving illegal slave trading and conspiracy among southern gentry. The audacity of it stole Elijah's breath. Abolitionists? Here. William has connections through his shipping business, trade with Boston and New York. He's been suspected of abolitionist sympathies for years. That's why he's on their list. She rose stiffly, her joints protesting the movement after sitting on Elijah's hard wooden stool. Eleanor thinks if we can get the documents to these men before the meeting, they can take them north immediately. Publication would destroy Thornton and his friends and might save countless lives. As Martha gathered her mending and departed, her final words hung in the air between them, "Bring the documents. And prepare yourself. After tonight, nothing will be the same." Left alone, Elijah moved the loose stone and withdrew the hidden papers. Studying them in the last light of day, the names, the routes, the evidence of conspiracy, all of it pointed to a network of corruption and cruelty far beyond what he'd imagined. Yet within this terrible knowledge lay the seeds of possibility. If exposed to the right people, these records could topple the powerful men who had built their fortunes on human suffering. He traced the map's lines with a careful finger, following the coastal routes where ships arrived with their human cargo, the inland paths where captives were transported to markets and plantations, the locations of holding pens where people were kept like livestock. Each notation represented dozens, perhaps hundreds of lives destroyed for profit. The ledger was even more damning. Meticulous records of bribes paid to customs officials, payments to ship captains, sales to plantation owners. Names, dates, amounts. The entire economic machinery of human bondage laid bare in columns of neat handwriting. And on the final pages, the list of enemies to be dealt with, including Eleanor's cousin and others who had shown even the slightest humanity towards slaves or criticism of the institution. Outside his window, the first stars appeared as darkness claimed the land. Somewhere to the north, 2 men from Wilkes County still ran free, carrying with them the desperate hope of liberty. Somewhere in the great house, Eleanor Thornton prepared to betray everything she had been raised to uphold. And throughout the slave quarters, people like Isaiah and Naomi lived with a quiet resistance that had never been extinguished despite generations of brutality. And here, in this small cabin built by enslaved hands, Elijah faced the most momentous decision of his life. Risk everything now on a desperate gamble for freedom and justice, or continue in bondage, waiting for a better moment that might never come. The North Star appeared above the tree lean, bright and unwavering. His path, at least for tonight, was clear. He carefully rewrapped the documents and tucked them inside his shirt, close to his heart. Then he extinguished his small lamp and sat in darkness, waiting for the plantation to sleep. The night sounds gradually changed as activities ceased, voices faded, doors closed, the occasional bark of dogs grew less frequent. Only then did he rise, moving with the silent precision of a man whose survival had often depended on remaining undetected. The 50 yards between his cabin and the main house stretched before him like an ocean to be crossed. Each step carried the weight of 300 years of oppression. Each breath drawn contained the hopes of generations yet unborn. The future itself seemed to hang in the balance as Elijah moved through the darkness, guided by starlight and the fierce determination that had sustained his people through their long nightmare of captivity. Behind him lay slavery and all its familiar horrors. Ahead, perhaps freedom or death in its pursuit. Either way, as Martha had said, after tonight, nothing would be the same.